Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Welcome to Discovering Joy with Roy. I'm Roy, and today we look at the first Beatitude and the first challenge to our usual priorities. This one takes issue with the popular boast, I deserve, and with the common lament, what did I ever do to deserve this? And with commercials like McDonald's long famous, when you deserve a break today at McDonald's. Or another long-running one, promoting a certain kind of perfume. It's expensive, but I'm worth it. Now this I deserve attitude is as far from the spirit of the first Beatitude as it can be. Jesus reserves his praise for people who admit they don't deserve and don't expect to be honored or coddled or handed good breaks or given everything that self-satisfied people are convinced should be theirs. The poor in spirit don't demand to be first in line. They don't head for the chief seats. This beatitude decidedly does not look out for number one. It's not one of Jesus' most popular sayings. There's a further difficulty with it. Matthew's version reads, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." But Luke's doesn't spiritualize Jesus' teaching at all. "Blessed are you who are poor," he says. Plain and simple and scary. Matthew we can handle. But what are we to make of Luke? Who can hear it? Well, what about the rich or the relatively so, like most of us middle-class Christians who own our own homes, mortgaged, drive our own cars, time payments? But these are luxuries that elevate us high above most of the world's population. Must we become poor, divest ourselves of our possessions to enjoy the blessings of God? The Greek word used here would almost lead you to think so. Matthew could have employed the word penes, which expresses the poverty of a person who has to work with his hands and provide for his own needs. But instead, Matthew opts for protos, the word for absolute, abject poverty. Luke compounds our consternation by quoting Jesus just 4 verses later. "But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort." Is this Jesus' way of saying you've already got what you wanted? What you were so certain you deserved? A Roman emperor in the 4th century, Julian the Apostate, is said to have quipped that he wanted to confiscate Christians' property so they might all become poor and thus enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, he was cynical, but he took Luke's version seriously. Philip Yancey is one of my favorite authors, and he kind of comes to my rescue here. He credits another author, Monica Helbig, for helping him, as he's helped me, to see some of the advantages of being poor. Jesus may have had some of these in mind in this beatitude. Number 1, the poor know they are in urgent need of redemption. They can't get out of their predicament on their own. They simply don't have the resources, so they aren't too proud to accept help. 2, the poor know not only their dependence on God and on powerful people, but also their interdependence with one another. When they pray, "God help me," they're in earnest, but when they ask other people to help them, family, friends, neighbors, church, they openly admit at that time also that they are powerless. Number 3, the poor rest their security on people, not things. Now, they may dream of ownership someday, but their real hope is in the persons who care about them, as well as the Lord. 4th, the poor have no exaggerated sense of their own importance and no exaggerated need of privacy. Unless you've been really poor, you don't realize what an expensive luxury privacy is. Number 5, the poor can distinguish between necessities and luxuries. You don't dine on croissants and jam when you can't afford bread and butter. Number 6, the poor can wait because they have acquired a kind of dogged patience born of acknowledged dependence. And in their waiting, they can see just how time poor are the money rich. 7, the poor can respond to the call of the gospel with a certain abandonment because they have so little to lose and are ready for anything. For the poor, there's only one way to go, and that's up. Well, I prefer Matthew's version to Luke's, not because I'm not poor, but because I've known some poor who did not fit Yancey's list. They're poor, but they're also too proud. They're impoverished, but they're not teachable. Being poor has embittered and isolated them, and they turn their anger against those who can best help them, even God. They haven't learned the lessons their poverty can teach them. Yet, I've included the list and my comments because both versions of Jesus' Beatitude demand attention. The Bible is far from silent on the subject of God's special concern for the poor. To be poor in spirit, in Matthew's phrase, is to be teachable, open to the Lord's leading. Some commentators believe that this beatitude is more important than the rest, because they consider it to be the base on which all the rest stand. They're probably right. If persons lack this fundamental humility, who can teach them? Blessings await the poor in spirit because they're willing for God to be God. I confess that I caught on to this a little bit when I was younger, when I finally decided that God can run the universe without my help. I think that's part of the meaning of being poor in spirit. The poor in spirit don't strut. They don't build their own empires. They don't delight in giving orders. They don't dictate others' emotions. They found a worthy master they're content to follow. They prefer learning to teaching, listening to talking, comforting to being comforted. They'd rather see than be seen. They want to be like Jesus, as described by the Apostle Paul in Philippians. Like Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. This, wouldn't you say, is what it really means to be poor in spirit? Be like Jesus? To see this beatitude in action, we're going to check out John the Baptist. In spite of the popularity of his ministry at the Jordan, John was able to keep his balance. He'd come to be the forerunner of the Messiah. His days in the limelight were numbered, and he knew it. When Jesus came to John to be baptized, John recognized the man whose fame and influence would soon eclipse his own. He later good-naturedly admitted, he must become greater, I must become less. A superb example of Jesus becoming greater as another becomes less is seen in the conversion of Zacchaeus. Now you might imagine that Zacchaeus is one of my favorite biblical characters, and I'm sure you remember his story. I'm going to read it to you so that I don't get carried away because I love to tell the story. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. He wanted to see Jesus. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, that's why he's one of my favorites, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this, and they began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay him back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." People like Zacchaeus. Now, Zacchaeus was wealthy. He raked in profits from the most notorious of professions in his day. He was a tax collector. But he wasn't satisfied. Would a complacent man have felt compelled when Jesus came to his life to disperse half of his holdings and repay by 4 times anyone he had cheated? What happened is that Zacchaeus had found someone far more satisfying than money. Suddenly he felt the need to rearrange his priorities. He who had chased wealth would now follow Jesus. This is not an unusual experience, especially among men and women in midlife. How many times as a pastor I've listened to someone speaking like this: "All my life I've been working to make money, to buy things for myself and my family. I've got to get out of this rat race. But I don't want to change to another job or career like the one I've got. I want to make a difference. I want some kind of ministry where I'm helping people. I want to serve the Lord." Tears often follow. They can't talk about this strong, overwhelming desire with dry eyes. They're like Zacchaeus, whose midlife conversion leads him from dissatisfaction to liberation to peace with God. First, the dissatisfaction. The much discussed midlife crisis may take many forms, but the root of the restlessness is the soul's dissatisfaction. I don't like what I'm doing. I'm scared my future may be nothing but more of the present. I don't like what life has done to me, and worst of all, I don't like the person I've become. They're like Zacchaeus, don't you think? You can't always tell by appearances who's hurting. Looking at people's careers, houses, cars, country clubs, you might conclude that they've arrived. You're impressed. Some of them aren't, though. These are all just things. And these things don't satisfy the soul's deepest longings. These people have bought the latest electronic gadgets, and they've seen the right movies, and they've taken their exotic vacations. Still, they hunger for more, or rather, for different. Ambrose Bierce wrote back in the 19th century that a Christian is one who follows Christ's teachings insofar as they are not incompatible with a life of sin. Well, it's obvious that description doesn't fit Zacchaeus, and I hope it doesn't fit you or me. But I can't help wondering whether Zacchaeus could have guessed, would ever have guessed, that Jesus would not only come to his house, but would become his master. Could he have guessed that changing his priority would cost him so dearly? See, you can't expect to announce yourself as a disciple of Jesus and keep on cheating and lying and building yourself up at someone else's expense. You see, the risk in looking for something different in life is that you may find it, and it'll change you. Zacchaeus must have been as surprised as the crowd when Jesus invited himself to the tax collector's home. "Zacchaeus, you come down. Come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." The seeker is being sought. Believers who have found Christ in midlife discover that he'd been waiting for them all along, looking for a sign that they were ready. Others, who have been lifelong disciples, testify that somewhere in midlife they discovered, in reviewing their lives up to that point, that the Lord has been guiding them all along, even when they thought they were making independent decisions. Zacchaeus seems to have come to a decision on his own. This decision: I can't have a fresh future if I don't settle past debts. He'll right his wrongs. He'll reach out to the poor he has ignored or cheated. He will seek first the kingdom of God. He used to make a top priority of lining his own pockets. No longer. Now, one thing that intrigues me about his story is that the story says nothing about Zacchaeus giving up his career. My guess is that Zacchaeus went right back to his tax table, but now as an honest broker. He's become a disciple of Jesus first and foremost. He will practice this discipleship under the difficult circumstances of his work. Zacchaeus used to be a tax collector. Now he's a disciple of Jesus who happens to be a tax collector. There's a big difference. Welcome home, Jesus says, in effect. Today, salvation has come to this house. You're where you belong, Zacchaeus. You're becoming the person God intended you to be. You can now grasp what another disciple of Jesus, Paul, will write several decades later. He tells his own before and after story in Philippians chapter 3. He recounts all the advantages that he used to enjoy as a religious leader in his pre-Christian life with what he now experiences as a Christian. And his conclusion, here it is. But whatever was to my profit, I now consider a loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ. Like Paul, Zacchaeus has gained Christ. Destination achieved. Blessings received. The blessing Jesus promises to the poor in spirit. The people who constitute the kingdom of heaven on earth. Jesus has another term for such people. He calls them the salt of the earth. Like salt, they aren't much to look at. They're never the main dish of the meal or the focus of attention. Just as salt makes food taste better, the poor in spirit make life better for others, and in blessing them, they themselves receive the greater blessing. That greater blessing is joy. The joy that comes only to the poor in spirit. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I bid you joy.